Have you ever woken up to the sound of bulldozers tearing through your family's legacy? I did. And what happened next changed everything. My name is Jack Thornton. I'm a 58-year-old rancher. And this land, 200 acres of rugged, sun-baked Montana soil, is my inheritance. My grandfather built it up with his bare hands. My father poured his life into it. And I took over after a long career elsewhere, determined to protect what they built. We worked cattle, grew hay, and watched the stars from the same porch where I now sip my morning coffee. 5 years ago, I lost my wife, Sarah. She was the soul of this place. After she passed, I planted a garden in her honor near the eastern ridge, wildflowers in every color she loved. I visit it every morning. It's where I talk to her. But that Tuesday in April, everything changed. I just finished feeding the horses when I heard the low roar of machinery coming from the eastern pasture. At first, I thought it was the county doing some road work. But as I drove up the rise, what I saw made my heart stop. Yellow excavators, dump trucks, and men in hard hats, carving a trench straight across my land, straight through Sarah's garden. I jumped out of my truck and stormed down the hill. "Hey, who gave you permission to be here?" I shouted. A foreman handed me a clipboard like he was delivering a pizza. "Signed Easement," he said, "authorized and filed." I looked at the paper, and my stomach turned. There was my name, my signature. Except it wasn't. It looked close, but not quite right. Off just enough to make my skin crawl. "You think I signed this?" asked. "That's what the file says." The man shrugged. And then he gestured toward a black SUV parked nearby. Out stepped Richard Westfield, president of the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. All slicked back silver hair, gold cufflinks, and smug arrogance. "Jack," he said like we were old friends, "sorry you had to find out this way. But we've got permits, approvals, and timelines. You'll be compensated, of course." "You forged my signature," I snapped. He smiled like a man used to getting his way. "The paperwork's already filed with the county. We're expanding Pinecrest, new homes, bigger lots. We need access to that spring water. This is happening whether you like it or not." He turned and walked away, leaving me staring at a pipeline trench that had torn through the most sacred place on my land. The excavator ripped up Sarah's wildflowers without a second thought. Yellow petals scattered in the wind like ashes. That's when I remembered who I was, what I used to be. Before I came back to Montana to run the ranch full-time, I spent 3 decades as a water rights attorney in Denver. I knew the law, and I knew what it looked like when someone tried to cheat the system. They thought I was just another rancher. They had no idea what they'd just started. By dawn the next morning, I was behind the wheel of my truck, headed west on Highway 2 toward the county seat. I hadn't slept, couldn't, all night. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the forged easement document, turning it over like it would suddenly confess its lie. But it didn't. It just sat there. A single sheet of paper that someone thought would be enough to steal what my family spent generations building. The clerk's office was quiet when I arrived. Just Martha behind the counter, sipping from a thermos that had seen better days. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Well, I'll be Jack Thornton. Been a while." "Martha." I nodded. "I need to see any recorded easements involving my property, specifically anything filed in the last 6 months." She raised an eyebrow, her smile fading as she turned to her computer. "That pipeline got something to do with it." I nodded once. She tapped a few keys, squinted at the screen, and then pulled a file from the cabinet. "Here's the recorded easement. Looks like it was filed about 8 weeks ago. Says you signed it in front of a notary." I opened the folder, scanned the page, and instantly felt my pulse rise. The signature looked like mine, but the flow was off. Too careful, too deliberate. Forgery, no doubt in my mind. "Mind if I compare this to the deed signature on file?" asked. Martha nodded and retrieved the original deed documents from the archive. "You're not going to like this, Jack," she said quietly. As I laid the 2 pages side by side, one signature was mine, fluid, confident. The other was a shaky imitation. A trace job, probably lifted from public records and duplicated by someone who thought I wouldn't notice. They didn't even get the middle initial right, I muttered. Jack, Martha said, lowering her voice. This is fraud, plain and simple. You need to take this to the DA. I will, I said. But first I need to know where that pipeline is getting its water from. She frowned. Isn't it your spring? I shook my head. Thought so too. But the line runs east to west. There's no direct line from my spring that would make sense for their system. Either they're diverting the supply, or they found another source. Martha tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking. Let me show you something. She led me back to the records room and pulled a topographical map from the wall. Then pointed to a shaded area just beyond the ridge behind both my ranch and the Pinecrest subdivision. See this parcel? Federal land. Blackstone Ridge. There's a spring here, real good flow, mostly used for wildlife. Years ago, water rights were leased to a man named Walter Jenkins. He lives over in Dawson County. Never developed the land much, but he maintained the rights. I leaned in closer. Sure enough, a dashed blue line marked Blackstone Spring trickled down from federal territory. And that's when the pieces began to fall into place. Martha, can you pull the record on those water rights? A few minutes later, she returned with a notice stamped in red. Tax lien. Auction scheduled. Walter Jenkins had failed to pay the property taxes tied to his leasehold interest, and the rights to the water. Rights no one in Pinecrest even realized they didn't own, were about to go up for auction. In 3 days, I stepped outside, the spring sunlight warming my face, and called the one person who knew water law almost as well as I did. Mike Daniels. Came the voice on the other end. Still waiting on you to come back and save me from the firm. Not today, I said, but I need your help. Urgently. I explained everything, the forged easement, the trench cutting through Sarah's garden, the HOA's blind ambition, and the overlooked detail that could bring the entire scheme crashing down. Mike let out a low whistle. They forged her signature and didn't secure the actual water rights. Correct. You get me copies of the easement and your deed. I'll draft a cease and desist and an injunction motion. But Jack, if this goes to court, you'll need leverage. Real leverage. I'll have it by Friday, I said, already back in the truck and headed home. The next 3 days were a blur. I cashed out the remainder of my retirement, secured a second loan against the ranch, and drove out to Walter Jenkins' trailer home in Dawson County. Walter was in his 90s, hard of hearing, but sharp as ever. When I explained what was happening, he looked at me through narrowed eyes and said, "Damn HOA types, always think the rules don't apply to them." He showed me the original lease agreement, still filed in his battered file cabinet, and wished me luck at the auction. "Make sure whoever wins it don't waste it," he said. "Don't worry," I replied. "I intend to use it very carefully." Meanwhile, Pinecrest's construction crews doubled their efforts. I watched from the edge of my land as they worked into the night, laying pipe with such speed it was almost desperate, as if they sensed something closing in on them. On Thursday, I parked my truck near the trench and took out my camera. I photographed the ripped earth, the dying wildflowers, the bulldozer tracks inches from the old iron fence that marked the family cemetery. Every shot felt like fuel on a fire I was about to unleash. Richard Westfield approached me that evening, all smug confidence. "Thought you'd be gone by now, Jack," he said. "Thought you'd be smarter, Richard." I replied. He sneered. "Our homeowners paid top dollar for access to that water. We've got attorneys, a timeline, and a permit. You can't stop progress. You're not getting that water," I said simply. His smile faltered for just a second. "What do you mean?" "You'll find out soon enough." I turned and walked away, the setting sun casting long shadows across my land. Shadows of what was coming, shadows of justice. Let them lay their pipe. Let them finish the trench. Because by the end of the week, I would own the spring. And when I did, the tap would run dry. The county auction was scheduled for Saturday morning at the Riverdale Community Center. A squat brick building that still smelled like old varnish and forgotten bingo nights. I arrived early, parked far from the entrance, and sat in my truck for a while, watching as a few early bidders trickled in. Ranchers, speculators, The occasional investment firm rep looking for an undervalued opportunity. I wore my oldest jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and a beat-up cowboy hat. No reason to look like someone with a plan. The water rights for Blackstone Spring were listed as Lot 37, scheduled midway through the day's auction. I sat near the back, flipping through the catalog as other items passed by. Easements, mineral leases, and timber access parcels. Nothing stirred much excitement. Until around 1:30 p.m., when the auctioneer announced, "Next up, Lot 37. Water rights to the Blackstone Mountain Spring. Currently supplying multiple adjacent properties. Opening bid, $50,000. Before I could raise my paddle, a familiar figure entered the room. Richard Westfield. He was dressed sharply, navy blazer, leather shoes polished like mirrors. He scanned the room, phone in hand, and nodded to two men seated near the front. Likely investors or legal muscle from the HOA. My stomach sank for a moment. Somehow he'd caught wind of the auction. He wasn't going to let this go without a fight. I ducked behind a support beam and waited. "Do I have $50,000? The auctioneer called. Richard raised his paddle. 50. I lifted mine. 55. Richard turned, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto mine. His brow furrowed. A flush of red crept up his neck. 60. He barked. 65. I shot back. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing faster than I expected. At $100,000, the room had gone quiet. By $140,000, the auctioneer was pacing nervously. Richard's phone buzzed constantly. Text messages, calls. Likely his board members frantically greenlighting higher bids. At $175,000, Richard hesitated. He looked to one of his companions, who whispered something urgently, then to his phone, which lit up again. A long pause. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. Going once, going twice. Richard's shoulders sagged. He didn't raise his paddle. Sold to Mr. Thornton for $175,000. The room let out a collective breath. I stood slowly, heart hammering. It had cost me nearly everything, retirement savings, the loan against my ranch. But the deed was done. I owned the spring. Richard approached me after the auction, his mask of charm gone. He looked like a man who just realized he was standing on a foundation of sand. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, voice low and sharp. "We've invested millions. Homes are already sold. Contracts signed. You think this is over a few wildflowers and fence lines?" I smiled. "This was never just about flowers. You broke the law. You forged my signature. You bulldozed my wife's memorial garden like it was a weed patch. I warned you." His jaw tightened. "We'll challenge the purchase. File an injunction. The HOA will offer to buy it out." I shrugged. "You're welcome to try. But the law's pretty clear. The spring's mine now." That evening, back at the ranch, I met with a crew I'd hired out of Helena. Men I trusted. We hiked up toward the Blackstone Spring just past the federal boundary. It took a few hours to get the valve installed. But when the final wrench turned, I stood there watching the flow narrow to a trickle and stop altogether. Below us, far across the ridge, I could see the gleam of pipeline segments winding through the landscape. Shiny, hollow, and now completely useless. The next morning, I got a call from Ted, my neighbor in Pinecrest, who'd always been more reasonable than most. "Hey Jack, the taps are dry over here. Garden hoses, sinks, nothing's working. Probably a supply issue," I said evenly. "You might want to check with your HOA." By noon, Pinecrest was in an uproar. HOA board members held an emergency meeting. Construction halted. Trucks were idling in place. I heard later that one angry homeowner threatened to sue after his landscaping team walked off the job due to lack of water. Richard didn't waste time. The very next morning, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into my driveway. He stepped out flanked by two men in suits. Lawyers. "Mr. Thornton," one said, offering a tight-lipped smile. "We'd like to make a formal offer on behalf of Pinecrest Estates." They slid a manila folder across my porch table. $200,000 for the water rights. A tidy 14% profit on my investment. I didn't even open it. "Gentlemen," I said, "come inside." Laid out on my kitchen table were photographs. Sarah's destroyed garden, bulldozer tracks over shattered flower beds, and pictures of their pipeline inches from my family's gravestones. Alongside them sat printed copies of both my deed and the forged easement, highlighted, annotated, and legally damning. "I have a counteroffer," I said, sliding a cease and desist order across the table. "Effective immediately, you're to halt construction, remove all equipment from my land, and prepare for criminal investigation into the forgery." Richard stared at the documents, his face drained of color. "You can't do this," he said. "There are families depending on that water. Children, elderly residents. None of them forged a legal document or tore up sacred ground." I replied, "But they're welcome to ask you why this happened." The attorneys exchanged glances. One whispered something. Richard stood, trembling with rage. "What do you want?" I smiled. "I'll give you my terms tomorrow." "And Richard, bring a pen. A real one this time." By the time the sun rose the next day, word had spread through Pinecrest Estates like wildfire. The spring had been shut off, and every home was dry. Toilets wouldn't flush. Faucets gurgled air. Lawn sprinklers clicked uselessly in the dirt. It didn't take long for panic to turn into fury. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. I wasn't invited, of course. But that didn't matter. Ted, my neighbor, was there. He texted me updates from the back row. "Ted? Richard's sweating. Crowd is pissed. Guy in lot 6 threatened to sue if his sod dies. Ted? They just admitted you bought the spring. You should hear these people yelling. It's a zoo." Meanwhile, I prepared. On my dining room table, I stacked 3 folders. One with photographs of the construction damage, Sarah's garden, torn fencing, the crushed headstones of wildflowers now forever gone. Another held all the legal documents I needed, evidence of the forged easement, notary discrepancies, handwriting analysis, and a sworn affidavit from Martha at the clerk's office. The third was my proposal. Right on time, the black SUV rolled up my drive. Out stepped Richard Westfield, now with deeper creases under his eyes and a red flush rising along his neck. The 2 lawyers from before followed him, both carrying leather briefcases, trying to project calm control. But I could see the strain behind their eyes. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to beg. "Mr. Thornton," one said, mustering civility, "we understand your position, but surely there's room for compromise. Pinecrest is willing to purchase the water rights for $250,000. That's a 40% return. More than fair." I motioned for them to sit at the porch table. "Before we get to numbers," I said, "let me show you something." I handed Richard the first folder. He flipped it open and froze. The first image was of the backhoe chewing through Sarah's wildflower memorial. The second showed the trench ripping straight through it, wild lupin flattened into mud. The third, a zoomed-in shot of the forged easement next to my original deed signature. Highlighted inconsistencies, an obvious fraud. Richard's jaw clenched. "What's the point of this?" "To remind you how we got here," I said. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a reckoning." I slid the second folder forward. "This is a cease and desist order, signed by Judge Carlin this morning. You are to stop all construction, cease use of the current pipeline, and vacate the easement corridor. The evidence of forgery will be turned over to the district attorney Monday morning unless we come to terms." The lawyer paled. "Mr. Thornton, you don't want a criminal case. We can settle this civilly." "You mean quietly," I replied. Richard's hands trembled as he pulled out the last folder. My terms. A single-page document, clearly printed in bold. Full removal of the pipeline and restoration of the disturbed land within 30 days. Replanting and rehabilitation of Sarah's memorial garden, using native wildflowers from the original seed mix she curated. A public apology from the HOA board, printed in the Pinecrest newsletter and posted at the community center. Financial compensation for damages, $50,000. Permanent conservation easement placed on my ranch to prevent any future development or encroachment. The HOA shall contribute to the legal costs of establishing the easement. No appeal, no negotiation, except within 48 hours, or I turn off the water permanently and file criminal charges. Richard stared at the page like it was a death sentence. You're out of your mind, he said finally. We can't agree to this. A public apology, a conservation easement. You want to bury us. No, I said, standing slowly. I want to protect what's mine, and you're the ones who chose to build your future on stolen ground. I'm just giving you a chance to walk away. The attorney leaned over to Richard and whispered urgently. After a moment, Richard looked back at me, and I saw something different in his eyes. Not rage, not arrogance, resignation. You'll hear from us within 48 hours, he said, voice low. I'm looking forward to it, I replied, holding open the screen door as they left. As they disappeared down the road, I returned to the porch, coffee mug in hand. The air was cool, clear. The mountains stood stoic and silent, as they always had, and for the first time in months the land felt like mine again. That night, I sat under the stars on the back porch, staring toward the eastern ridge. Sarah's garden was still a scarred mess, but not for long. I could almost hear her voice again, light and firm. Good. You made them listen. The next day Ted visited. He looked weary, but relieved. They're gonna fold, he said. HOA board met again this morning. Most of the members are furious with Richard. One guy said it's the worst mismanagement he's ever seen. Did they read the terms? Asked. Ted nodded. Yep, some wanted to fight it. But the forgery. That's serious. They're scared, Jack. They know you've got them dead to rights. 2 days later, an envelope was delivered to my ranch by certified courier. Inside, a signed agreement, accepting every condition listed in my proposal. At the bottom, in trembling ink, was Richard Westfield's signature. This time very real. The restoration crews arrived by the end of the week. I oversaw everything. The careful regrading of the trench, the planting of Sarah's flowers, and the removal of the last pipe segment from the edge of my property. I had stonemasons build a new wall around the family cemetery. Solid granite with an iron gate. No one would ever trespass there again. And Pinecrest, the HOA barely survived the scandal. Richard resigned in disgrace, under pressure from residents and lawyers alike. At the next community meeting, the board voted to never again pursue land outside their subdivision boundaries. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. I had my land, my peace, and Sarah's garden growing again. The HOA accepted every one of my terms. They didn't have a choice. Within days, the construction crews returned not to build, but to undo. Under court supervision and local press coverage, the HOA's hired contractors dismantled every inch of pipeline that crossed my land. What had taken them 2 weeks to dig took nearly a month to remove. Carefully, methodically, under my watchful eye, I made sure of it. And right there in the center of it all, Sarah's garden bloomed once again. It took work. Weeks of reseeding, irrigation, and patience. But the wildflowers came back. Lupins, Indian paintbrush, bluebells, prairie coneflowers. I planted them myself, with the same trowel Sarah used, kneeling in the soft dirt, hands calloused but steady. I knew every stem by heart, and this time, I placed a small wooden sign at the garden's edge. Sarah's stand. May her roots always remain. The HOA issued their public apology at the next community meeting. Just as I required, they read the statement aloud and printed it in their newsletter. It was more heartfelt than I expected. Maybe the board had finally realized what they'd become. Or maybe they just feared litigation. Either way, Richard Westfield was not there. He had resigned the week prior. After the forgery evidence was submitted to the district attorney, the last I heard, he'd left town entirely. Some whispered disgrace about pending investigations. Justice, it seemed, had finally found him. But the real victory wasn't legal, it was legacy. With the HOA support and their legal team's help, a bitter irony I savored. I finalized the conservation easement on my land. It legally protected all 200 acres from future development. No one, not a board, a company, or a government, could ever run another pipeline, dig another trench, or touch the soil here without permission. Sarah's garden, our family cemetery, the barns, the hayfields. All of it would stay as it was, even long after I'm gone. The story made local headlines. Rancher turns the tables on HOA in water rights battle, Red One. Another dubbed me the last stand of Blackstone Ridge. Reporters came out for interviews. I declined most, but I gave one quote that ran in the local paper. They thought I'd roll over, but some things are worth fighting for. Land, legacy, memory. They tore up the flowers, but they didn't realize who planted them. Soon, other ranchers started calling. Folks from across Montana and beyond. People who dealt with HOAs, developers, or city councils that tried to muscle them out. They asked for advice. Some wanted legal help. Others just wanted to hear how I did it. So I started telling my story online, in town halls, at co-op meetings. Not for glory, but because I wanted others to know what I had learned. You don't need to be rich or ruthless to stand your ground. You just need to know the law, know your rights, and never let them scare you off your own land. Eventually, I created the Blackstone Water Trust, a non-profit entity that held the water rights to the spring I'd fought so hard for. I didn't keep it all to myself. Instead, I opened access to a limited number of Pinecrest homeowners, those who wanted a sustainable water source for gardens, not golf courses. Usage was strictly regulated, metered, and billed at cost, with excess funds going toward land conservation and watershed protection. The trust's board included both ranchers and Pinecrest residents. It was a small, symbolic act of peace, and it worked. 1 year later, Sarah's garden was in full bloom again. The family cemetery had a stone wall around it now, with hand-forged iron gates. The trench was gone, filled with native grasses and replanted spruce. No scars remained. Ted stopped by that morning with coffee and a grin. "You know what's funny?" he said, settling into a chair on my porch. "Property values in Pinecrest went up. Turns out, people like knowing their water's secure, and the land around them isn't going to become a strip mall." Sarah always said, I smiled, that doing the right thing pays off in ways you can't predict. He looked out at the ridge. "You ever think about selling water to the whole valley?" I shook my head. "No, that spring isn't for profit. It's for balance. It's for people who remember where they are, not just what they want." He nodded, quietly. The sky stretched wide above us. Montana blue and endless. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the soft hum of bees dancing through Sarah's flowers. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really was. It was about standing up when no one else would. About preserving what matters. About planting something in memory and knowing it'll keep blooming, even after you're gone. So if you ever find yourself in the fight of your life, against developers, lawyers, or bulldozers, remember this. You're not just protecting land. You're protecting stories, roots, ghosts, and they're worth fighting for. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And don't forget to share your own stories below, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give up.